So I wanted to there's a kind of a I want to share a favorite line of mine. Somebody who used to sit with us wrote a poem about it, which I'll share with you. Allison. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about going away for 6 weeks, which I'm getting ready to do. I was reading something about Thoreau. I think I'll just read that first. You know, when he was laying, I bet most of you, I read this like quite a while ago, and I couldn't remember it, where I found it, and the way I remember it, it was his aunt who came to see him, I guess, at Walden Pond when he was dying. He was pretty young, I think, but he was very sick and he was dying, and I think it was his aunt. But what I just read recently, it was a friend. So of course it could have been his friend, but his aunt could have been. So she came to see him, and she said, "I want to know if you've made peace with your God." What would you say if someone asked you that, Beverly? I want to know if you've made peace with God. And he looked and he said, "Well, I didn't know we were quarreling." Isn't that good? So, you know, he chopped wood, and he worked for Emerson, and he did odd jobs. He was the most interesting character. So he wrote in his journal not too long before he left working for Emerson. And let's see if I can find it. He said, he wrote in his journal, "I want to go soon and live away by the pond where I shall hear only the wind whispering among the trees, the reeds." He said, "It will be a success if I shall have left myself behind." So I think when you go on a long retreat, as Jane and I have done, maybe you think about leaving yourself behind. So he went to he built with his own hands a little cabin, tiny little cabin right there, just very near the pond. And later on, this is what he said about it. "Sometime in a summer morning, having taken my accustomed bath, I sat in my sunny doorway from sunrise till noon, wrapped in reverie, amidst the pines and hickories and sumachs, in undisturbed solitude and stillness, while the birds sang around or flitted noiselessly through the house, until by the sun falling in my west window, or the noise of some traveler's wagon on the distant highway, I was reminded of the lapse of time." I love this next sentence. "I grew in those seasons like corn in the night, and they were far better than the work of the hands would have been. They were not time subtracted from my life, but so much over and above my usual allowance. I realized what the Orientals meant by contemplation and the forsaking of works. I love the idea of the corn growing by night as we sit in silence. The idea that we're growing in some way, right? That is perhaps unknown to that Protestant ethic that most of us grew up with. You know, that you got to work, you got to work. You got to do, you got to produce, right? You got to write a book, read a book, or whatever. But I was reminded of the lapse of time. I grew in those seasons like corn in the night, and they were far better than the work of the hands would have been. I think that's so wonderful. So for me, that is like sort of anticipating going away again. It's amazing. I got back in January after sitting for 5 weeks, and so here I am getting ready to go again for 6 weeks. And I think of what Thoreau said. I think about perhaps leaving yourself behind. Leaving yourself behind in the sense of that small self, grasping self, clinging self, that self that sometimes it gets so loud, doesn't it? So loud inside. I went to Gelson's to get the Bing cherries, right? And I tell you, by the time I got back, I was ready to murder at least 55 people. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, the traffic was incredible. And people in Southern California, you know what the sun has done to our brains. I mean, it's just... So, get out of the way. But that is the little self. And the little grasping, clinging, it's like this. That little self wants just a free drive from here to Gelson's, get your Bing cherries, and come back, right? No problem, right? Isn't that what we want? We want life without any interruptions, any problems. Remember when I told you I had a picnic when we were at the lunch, when we did an all-day retreat at Pacific Unitarian Church, and I got mad at the wind? I did. It's the truth. I was sitting there and the wind kept blowing my napkin down and it kept knowing. And I finally I was furious with the wind. And then I thought, there's something wrong with this. So anyway, I wanted to share with you, as I said, I'm going to share it's one of my most favorite sayings. I want to share it with you again. I have referred to it many times in Dharma Talks. And as I said, at one time it even inspired Allison to write a little poem, which I'll read to you. And let's see if I can find, So I'm going to set it up by a wonderful story. This is a Tibetan story. It's an old one. And who was it? It was Geshe Drum. Rating Monastery. So he's walking out. He's the Geshe, right? He's the big kahuna. So he's walking out one day and he sees this old guy, 90 or 100 years old. No, he saw this old guy circumambulating the temple, right? Which is something you do. I mean, it's a sign of great respect. You walk around. People will walk around a stupa, right, in India or in Asia, where there may be a relic of the Buddha or of some great enlightened being. That's a sign of respect. So he goes outside and he sees this old man walking around the temple. And so he says to him, Sir, I'm so happy to see you circumambulating the temple, but wouldn't you rather be practicing the Dharma? So, that probably got the little guy. He said, I'd stop. Maybe if it were me, I would think, I thought that's what I was doing. So the guy thinks about it, he says, well, sure, So the Geshe walks away, and so he thinks about it, and so he goes inside the temple. He goes into the library and he finds some of the scriptures, and so he pulls out, one of the great books, and goes back out in the courtyard and sits down and starts reading the scriptures. So out comes the guy and says, Sir, I'm so happy to see that you're reading the Dharma. But he said, but wouldn't you rather be practicing the Dharma? Well, now the poor old guy, what the hell do you think I'm doing? That's, of course, what I would think. He probably would not have done that because he was more respectful. So that gave him a pause, He's reading the sutras. So he says, wouldn't you rather be practicing the Dharma? So he says, oh. So he puts his book down, and he probably walks back into the library. He thinks about it. He says, okay. So what do you think he did then? He walked into the temple. He sat down on the cushion, maybe on a bench just like Jane. Sat down, lowered his eyes, and he sat in meditation. the story does not end. So he's sitting in my meditation, and he slowly opens his eyes, and there's old Geshe Drum sitting right in front of him. He says, "I'm so happy to see that you're meditating, sir." But he says, "Wouldn't you rather be practicing the Dharma?" So this poor old guy, he says, by then he must have been pretty upset, and he says, "Well, please, sir," he said, Tell me what it would mean to be practicing the Dharma. He probably should have asked that question first, don't you think? But anyway, so what does it mean that I should do, or what should I do to practice the Dharma? So here's what the Geshe said. To practice means that there should be no distinction between the Dharma and your own mind. Now John's over there thinking, no distinction between the Dharma and your own. So, it's a wonderful, wonderful story. As I read that story, I was thinking of the fact that Buddhism, which is actually an English word and a European word. I don't think, if you had told the Buddha, did you know that you're teaching Buddhism, he probably would have been extremely surprised. And they certainly did not use that word to describe themselves for a long time. But it certainly is, if you think about the way it divided itself up into the Theravada and the wisdom, the teaching of the elders, and the Mahayana and the Vajrayana, the Tibetan, as we were just reading, the Zen, Pure Land, all of these extraordinary different traditions, all containing unbelievable truth. Every single one of them, and different, not the same. It's not like they were a repeat of each other. And to some extent, they're each, teaching a technique to get you to practicing the Dharma, whatever that means, practicing the Dharma. But it is certainly the case that the Tibetan, what he's trying to get this guy to see is that there's no technique, there's no practice. You can practice in any as long as you want. But as long as there's this separation of the mind, this is this and that, as long as you separate the Dharma into this thing that you're trying to learn or trying to grasp or trying to get, whatever it is, as long as there's this separation, then the teacher would say, well, why don't you quit that and practice the Dharma instead? So this brings me to one of my favorite all-time sentences. It really is. It's in the preface to the Blue Cliff record. It's wonderful. The wise enshrine the miraculous bones of the ancients within themselves. That's a wonderful thing. The wise enshrine the miraculous bones of the ancients within themselves. So number one, wouldn't you say that in that situation there would be no distinction between mind and Dharma? I mean, if it has been enshrined within you, or as Ajahn Chah used to say, right? If the Dharma is sitting in the middle of your head, right? It's got the main seat in your house, right? If it's sitting there, if it's enshrined within you, then that is the true meaning of practicing the Dharma. And so I wanted to say, the miraculous bones, they believed, like when the Buddha was passed away and was cremated. And this is kind of a common story of great enlightened beings, not only in Buddhism but in Hinduism. They say that there'll be the relics of little pieces of bone that will be left, and that there will be these like little pearls, translucent little pearls that the bone has turned to like this translucent and just like this beautiful thing, and like a jewel. And they say that sometimes it's different colors even, right? Beautiful, gorgeous, rainbow colors. And so that's what they will put in the stupas, right? Those relics, and they'll put them in like a little urn. And I suppose, supposedly, the more enlightened you are, the more of those little pearls are left for bones. So you can well imagine how many pearls, if they burned all of us up, we couldn't fill that bowl up with all of them, really. So that's the miraculous bones. That's probably the meaning of the saying, right? That the miraculous bones. So rather than enshrining the miraculous bones in a stupa and circumambulating it, or reading about it, or even sitting. So from now on, we'll never be meditating again. This is the last day we're finishing it. Let me just slip this in, because this is the meaning. This is an extraordinary statement too. I've always loved one of my very favorite teachers, Da Wei, in China. He said, and you could almost hear the frustration in his voice. He said, he said, I wish there was some other way to teach rather than meditation. But he says, there's not. Right? So he says, there is, so anyway, he went on and taught meditation, although he could feel in his gut, all of the potential to get stuck in it. He said, making a nest out of it. He always said, you people quit making a nest. He said, you hear something important and then you make a nest out of it, right? So that's what he meant by, I wish there was some other way. And so and for sure, that's what the Tibetan teacher was saying when he wasn't telling the guy who had finally sat in, like number 3 choice to sit down and close his eyes. He wasn't saying that is an unskillful thing to do. Quite the opposite. It's a very skillful thing. But again, if you think that's going to do it, it's that technique, the most perfect technique in the world, sitting for 11 months or 6 weeks. It's the leaving the self behind, as Thoreau said. That's, if you have left the self behind, there's room for the Dharma. And if you haven't left the self behind, if I haven't left the self behind, then there's 2 things going on, right? There's me and the Dharma, right? Great, right? And so then I can sit and spout, scriptures to the end of time, and I can impress you, or a few of you, one of you maybe, Beverly. I can always impress Beverly. Because she thinks I'm cute. But in other words, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. If there's me in the Dharma, if there's you in the Dharma, if there's Jane in the Dharma, if there's John in the Dharma, that is not leaving the self behind, which means that there's some space available for enshrining the miraculous bones of the ancients within yourself. If there's no room in there for the ancient bones, for the miraculous bones of the ancients, there's not any room in there to enshrine them. How the hell did they get enshrined, Travis? So, so again, if I am filled up with the 10,000 things, there's no room. There's no room. So maybe if I'm filled up with the 10,000 things, so maybe like 8,095 of them will be the Dharma. All of the brilliance of the Dharma and the sitting and whatever. But it isn't the same thing as what he's suggesting to this old guy who's maybe learned something extraordinarily important. That there is a way, there is such a thing as becoming the Dharma. It becoming you and you becoming it. And it seems to me that this is a enormous problem that we face. As Buddhism comes west, as it is doing for sure, it's here, and it is integrating more and more and more into our lives. I mean, Thoreau was reading about the Mahayana Buddhism right there just before he went to Walden Pond. That's 1860. I mean, so it was coming in by then. Actually, even earlier, but it was definitely coming in. It was, it was by the late 1800s. It was here. Jung had this. I'm just full of these famous sayings today. Well, there are a lot of smart people who've been at this for a long time, and to listen to them and to honor them is part of what we have to do. He had this great suspicion. He worried tremendously about what would happen as Buddhism came and came west. And I'm just going to paraphrase, because he said, we'll turn anything into a technique. He says it doesn't matter, right? It's just our nature. And in fact, bless his heart, he tended to think that we're going to have to that Christianity was going to have to be our way. I once wrote it's going to be a long time if that's our way, because it's got a lot of changing to do. But he said that because he worried. He never doubted the extraordinary brilliance of Buddhism. In fact, he supposedly said, I've not found it recently, but I wrote it down. He once said that Buddhism was the most perfect of all religions. He said it was the most perfect of all religions. Although he was a Christian, Swiss. But so in other words, it isn't that he was denigrating Eastern teaching at all. His concern was our relentless turning everything into a technique. It's just our nature as Westerners, right? You can look at what we've done and what we've accomplished, and medicine doesn't matter. It's extraordinary. So he was very doubtful about that, you can take it as you want it, because my feeling is, I used to sort of have a little humor with that, because the idea of, well, Mr. Jung, the train has left that station, honey. You can worry about it all you want, but this train has left, right? And so now I think the thing for us to do is to just simply, as a koan almost, to hold that question, So what does that mean? That as much as I love the Dharma or the teaching or the meditation, that my nature is to turn it into a to use it as a technique, which means that I'm not going to leave myself behind. And it also means that I'm just going to actually aggrandize myself. Myself is going to become even more marvelous, because it even has more technique. Watch me now. I can close my eyes and become very still. And maybe I can close my eyes and actually even go into silence. That's pretty mind-boggling. But and yet some subtle ego it's so phenomenal. It can actually do that and stay quite cohesive. It's really serious, It's my great concern about mindfulness in California, and I don't put it down, what people are doing at inside LA and other places. It's like there's a great deal of good from the flocks of therapists, the hundreds of therapists. I remember I went to a seminar Jack Kornfield led in LA, and I mean, it was all therapists. We were all, a bunch of us. I mean, I bet there were 400 of us. And he was talking, and then he started talking about how important mindfulness was in therapy, and then he introduced Trudy and Inside LA, and so I was just, it was amazing to me because I thought, oh my God, all of the therapists right here will certainly be inclined to learn mindfulness. And so I guess I just want you to hear me when I say I am not putting it down. I mean, that therapists are using mindfulness to work with people. It's wonderful. But what if it's really just increasing your ability, a technique, as opposed to just what Thoreau said about leaving himself behind, I mean, how many people are interested in leaving yourself behind? Well, yes, we know you are. You're going to school. He's going to Naropa next week? 2 weeks? Yeah, you'll lose you'll leave it behind, I bet. So anyway, but my point being that, I do think that for us as Westerners, and really just like when we read, like even Thoreau said, leave yourself behind? What's wrong with you, buddy? So I just wanted to share that with you. I think I'll read Alice's poem because it's lovely. To me, if Buddhism, as it comes to the West, and we'll just say, how far west can you be but California, right? It could be Hawaii. But as Buddhism comes to the West, the core teaching of it, you can dispense with a lot of stuff, but the core teaching is that you must, I'll just repeat old Thoreau. We have to leave the self behind. That grasping, clinging, whining, laughing, sad, whatever. But that little self that clings inside us, just clings and says, me. Right? It's like, like you talk to me and that little self says, hurry up and quit talking so I can say something. Right? And of course, then we can't hear what someone says, of course, because we're just so anxious for them to hear what we have to say. So, if Buddhism, if it's diluted to the point that it loses that, then it will have failed to really integrate into our culture. It really will, and the jury is out. I'm not saying that for us because we're all of this similar accord here. But in the larger sense, I truly believe that the jury is out in terms of the essence of what the Buddha taught 2,500 years ago, what he really taught, and what we struggled to learn. It's not clear. I'm very hopeful. So, how did it go? The wise enshrine the miraculous bones of the ancients within themselves. We don't put it in a stupa and walk around it. We don't put it on an altar and bow to it. We don't sing songs and praise of it. To the degree that we are really, really, really able, we enshrine it within ourselves. And it's it. I don't quite know how to do that in the world. I've never figured it out, so I go away for 6 weeks. That's why I'm going away, because I've never quite figured out how to do it. And so I go away and get a little closer. Every time I get a little closer, and come back with a little less victory. I mean, forever, a little less. Little pieces. It chips away, but there's still enough left so that I'm still troubled. So here is Allison's poem. You agree, don't you, Cindy?
No, I was going to tell you I disagree. But
Well, no, but I mean, no, but you did say that I'm still, you know, like,
I did say that.
you did say, well, it's sarcastic. Well, you said sarcastic, and you said another word that was really good.
I can't remember.
Rebel. Okay, so here's what Allison wrote after an all-day retreat, and she, so because she had really been contemplating. I think that this was, I was talking about the miraculous bones at that all day. We converge in the early mornings, singular minds and sturdy bodies, settling on our separate mats, clutching our complicated stories. I love that. Social smiles pasted on weary faces. We shield our battered hearts and hide our collective eye. As watery sun inches across pellucid sky, we sit and walk and sit, with measured step and even breath, training monkey mind. Slowly, imperceptibly, the marrow of our ancestors infuses our bones as we show our soft underbelly stretched out like the dead. Trust, says our teacher. Turn the light within. Sitting tall at close of day, the barking dog is stilled. Do you remember that, Beverly? I do. That dog barked the whole day, and then at the very end of the thing, it's just lovely. Sitting tall at close of day. Marta remembers it too, I bet. The barking dog is still. The sweet song of a singular bird calls out with her small, clear voice, as if in response, our singular selves rise up and merge to fill the room with one singular mind, thrumming like a tuning fork to the communion of sorrow shared in our silent world. Our light shines, no blinds through the cracks in our vulnerable hearts. I am undone. That's leaving the self behind. I am undone. We don't want to be undone, do we? And yet we must be.